Mohammed Fayed, sexual predator. Hello, I'm hgtudor. Previously, I provided you with a detailed video examining various allegations and evidence that have been advanced in relation to the behaviour of Mohammed Fayed, who is an individual who is clearly a narcissist. More information has been provided which helps you understand the mindset of the narcissist and one who is a sexual predator. This information has come courtesy of a number of newspapers, starting with The Times, where David Brown writes, Mohammed Fayed used his French properties and the super yacht, where Diana, Princess of Wales, spent a final holiday with her sons, to carry out brutal sex attacks, his former assistants have revealed. The Harrods tycoon ordered, sense of entitlement, assertion of control, young female staff to travel with him to France, often accompanied by celebrity guests. 3 former assistants gave graphic descriptions of abuse on the super yacht, Fayed's Paris mansion, which was the home of King Edward VIII following his abdication, and even the luxury apartment of his own son, Dodi, who was killed alongside Diana. The prolific nature, of course, of using these various venues demonstrates the fact that Fayed not only had no concern in relation to who he was carrying out sex attacks on, which is a lack of boundary recognition and absence of emotional empathy, along with a form of manipulation, that he deemed that it was appropriate for him to do so wherever he so chose, demonstrating his arrogance and disregard for individuals. 9 women claimed they were sexually assaulted in France, including one who said she was raped. Fayed is also alleged to have attacked women at the Ritz Hotel in Paris and his Castle St. Therese villa in Saint-Tropez on the Côte d'Azur. Lindsay Mason, now aged 55, was 20 when she joined Harrods in 1989 as one of Fayed's assistants. She said the businessman groomed her with gifts, bribery, love bombing, before sexually assaulting her at his private apartment in Mayfair. Despite the attack, she agreed to travel with him to Paris. This, of course, often results in criticism from those that would say, why on earth would you continue to have an involvement with somebody who has attacked you sexually? But that demonstrates a lack of understanding of the mindset of the victim, who feels beholden to the individual, that fears that there could be adverse consequences if they do not go along with that individual. And it may well be the case that they have their own thoughts being corrupted by emotional thinking. Mason said they were accompanied by Selina Scott, the television presenter, Jeff Banks, the fashion designer, and Barry Humphries, the Australian comedian better known as Dame Edna Everage. Notice that Fayed's courting of these individuals is done to triangulate other people with them, but also as character trait acquisition. There is no suggestion that the celebrity guests were aware of anything untoward. She recalled they took Fayed's helicopter to RAF Northolt in West London, and then his private jet to Paris, along with another young assistant. Mason said the assistants were ordered to go shopping, sense of entitlement, and then do a fashion show for the celebrity guests' objectification at Villa Windsor, the neoclassical former royal residence which Fayed had renovated. They then had dinner at the Ritz, which was also owned by Fayed. Mason described how Fayed tried to rape her after he said they would spend the night at Dodi's apartment overlooking the Arc de Triomphe. I managed to kick him off. I barricaded myself in my bedroom with an armoire, she said. I slept on the floor with my back to that so that I would be able to feel if he tried to come in and finish the job. Mason believes she was drugged, as she has no memory of leaving the bedroom until she arrived back at Harrods, where she was imprisoned for hours, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy, in the management offices guarded by security. I thought, what's he going to do at the end of this day, she said. If he's tried to rape me, drug me, more than likely traffic me, it's not going to end well, is it? I was actually scared for my life, so I just ran for my life. Gemma, 42, who was Fayed's personal assistant from 2007 and 2009, described how he attacked her on his 208-foot super yacht, Jonicle, where Diana and Princes Harry and William spent a holiday shortly before her death. She recalled a dinner on the yacht which was moored in Monaco, with Cheryl Cole, the singer, her then husband Ashley Cole, the England footballer, and Piers Morgan, the television presenter. Again, rubbing shoulders with famous people, triangulation, and character trait acquisition. She said Al Fayed threw a lobster at her during dinner because he was angry at her failure to make conversation. Threat to control, devaluing behaviour. If you'd pushed his advances away that morning, you knew you were in for a rough afternoon of humiliation and angry behaviour. Ignition of fury as a response to the threat to control. If he felt satisfied, you'd be like a princess. You're painted white. He'd shower you with gifts, bribery. He'd arrange an elaborate dinner. She said Fayed tried to force his way into her cabin, lack of boundary recognition. When she complained to the tycoon security that he had ordered the removal of the key to her cabin door, they advised her to use chopsticks to prevent it from being forced open. Gemma also described being raped at Villa Windsor before Fayed handed her a bottle of Dettol disinfectant and ordered her to wash herself. Belittlement. Catherine, aged 51 now, who worked for Fayed in 2005, said before foreign trips the assistant passports were taken off them and would not be returned until they were back at Harrods. Control. During one trip, Fayed ordered her to stay with him at Villa Windsor. I went to bed that night. There was no lock in the door, she recalled. I hadn't realised as the evening came on everyone disappeared. I blocked my door with a chair and my suitcase, and the next day I went down to start my day's work and he called me into the office, right up to his face, and said, "Never fucking block a door in my house again. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" There's only one way he knew that I had blocked the door, because he'd obviously tried it. When he went back to London, he tried to force himself on me in his office. I forced him off and said, "I'm a PA and that's all I do." The next day, when I went in, my desk had gone. Nullification of threat to control through dismissal. Thus, further revelations about his behaviour, which took place at a variety of venues in relation to staff, demonstrating once again the absence of emotional empathy, his sense of entitlement, the lack of boundary recognition. But that wasn't the only hunting ground that was utilised by Fayed. As is reported in the Telegraph, precautions were put in place to protect Fulham Football Club's women's team from the club's late owner, Fayed. A former manager has said 5 women have alleged that they were raped by Fayed, who died last year at the age of 94, with others alleging sexual misconduct. Gort Horgenes, who managed the Fulham women's team from 2001 to 2003, told the BBC that members of staff were aware Fayed liked young, blonde girls, somaticism, and steps were taken to protect the players from the late billionaire. He said, "I read all the newspapers yesterday, of course, and to be honest, it's not the biggest surprise. We were aware he liked young blonde girls, so we just made sure that situations couldn't occur. We protected the players." A Fulham spokesperson said, "We are deeply troubled and concerned to learn of the disturbing reports following yesterday's documentary. We have sincere empathy for the women who've shared their experiences. We are in the process of establishing whether anyone at the club is or has been affected. Should any person wishing to share information or experiences related to these allegations, we encourage them to contact the club at," provides an email address, "or the police." Fayed bought Fulham in 1997, and under his ownership they rose to the top half of the Premier League in the early 2000s, peaking when they reached the final of the Europa League in 2010. He sold the club in 2013. The legal team, featured in the BBC documentary called Fayed, Predator at Harrods, where more than 20 former female employees spoke to the broadcaster as part of a special investigation. At the press conference, an alleged victim of Fayed, who went by the name of Natacha, said, "The fear installed left me paralysed." She said, "These private meetings turned into more of a forced kiss, his hands gripping your face to his lips or pulling you down on his lap, where his hands were free to explore any part of your body that he wished. These incidents lasted seconds, but the fear installed me left me paralysed." Of course, demonstrates once again the absence of emotional empathy and his sense of entitlement. Once again, this is demonstrative of the way that he functioned, whereby any of his properties, any of his businesses, he deemed that it was appropriate to attack women. That he wasn't concerned about how they felt, because he had no emotional empathy. That he deemed that they were mere chattels that could be utilised by him. That he was a sexual predator on his yacht. That he was a sexual predator at Harrods. That he was a sexual predator at his properties. that he was a sexual predator in relation to the women's team at Fulham Football Club, so that the club recognised that he liked young blonde women for the purposes of ensuring that they were kept away from them. It's further reported, this time by Gordon Rayner in The Telegraph, that Fayed was so brazen about the fact that he was molesting and raping young female employees that one former manager at Harrods told the BBC that anyone who worked in a senior position for Fayed who claims not to have known what he was up to is a liar. This demonstrates the pervasive nature of his behaviours and how he did little to hide it from those that worked for him. He even sexually assaulted one employee called Catherine in front of 3 of his own children, and then tried to force himself on her when they were asleep in a nearby room. Another employee, Natasha, says she was sexually assaulted by him on a weekly basis whenever she was alone with him in his office. Neither of them, in common with all of the other victims, or survivors as they prefer to be termed, had anyone they could turn to help within Harrods, whose monstrous owner used money and menace to shut down, nullification of threat to control, any attempt to get a message to the outside world about what really went on inside the world's most famous department store. Natasha and Catherine say they come as a pair, were only able to speak out thanks to the strength they draw from each other. Speaking to the Sunday Telegraph after the press conference in a hired function room on the edge of Hyde Park, they are exactly the sort of people you'd imagine Harrods would have hired, well-spoken, well-mannered, immaculately turned out. They innocently thought the same when they were hired in 1990, but they now have no doubt they were hired not as model employees, but as potential prey. They tell of a modus operandi that was repeated down the decades by Fayed to ensure a steady conveyor belt of victims who were hired, befriended, groomed, molested, and then in some cases raped. I was a country bumpkin, says Natasha, as she describes the naive 19-year-old she was when she fell into Fayed's orbit. Natasha and Catherine, who was also 19, were signed up with the same recruitment agency, which sent them both for interviews as assistants to Fayed's personal assistant within months of each other in 1990. Both were slim, blonde, and pretty, and both now suspect the agency sent them to Harrods knowing that was what Fayed preferred. Both unexpectedly found themselves being interviewed by Fayed himself, which of course would be rather unusual for an owner of a business to interview 2 19-year-olds. Naturally, he's doing so because he wants to assert control over them and ascertain whether they would make appropriate victims for what he wanted to do. Asked to describe Fayed's office, Catherine comes up with one word: gold. Natasha says the sense of opulence and grandeur was quite overwhelming at that age. Grandiosity, somaticism. Each was hired straight away, believing they had landed their dream job. Fayed was like an uncle or a father, she adds, telling her to call her Papa. We were lulled into a false sense of security. He would say that if you do your job well, you are part of our family, you want for nothing. He was charismatic. He put you at ease, all part of the way that he would groom. Catherine says he had his own children. He had 2 daughters. He was married. Even if you were grown up, you don't suspect someone like that of being a threat. Shockingly, Catherine was to discover that Fayed was even prepared to use his young children as a means of disarming his victims and catching them off guard, triangulation with children. 4 or 5 months into her employment, she was asked to go to Fayed's mansion in Oxford, Surrey, to help his daughter Camilla with piano lessons one Saturday. When I got there, he introduced me to his children and his wife, says Catherine. He made you feel that if you worked for him, you were like family, assertion of control. She was led to a huge playroom that contained a piano but also a ball pit. And out of nowhere, he picked me up, put his hand right up my skirt and sort of groped and threw me in. I remember being submerged and resurfacing, and all of them were laughing at me. I felt a sense of humiliation of what just happened. It all happened so quickly. It almost excited him more to see you petrified or terror-struck. Negative fuel. The more vulnerable you were, the more he seemed to get some satisfaction or pleasure out of it. This is demonstrating the narcissist's receipt of negative fuel, which is more potent. Catherine says the sexual assault happened in front of 3 of Fayed's children after his wife had left the room. Later that night, she had dinner with the children's nanny and went to bed in a room down the corridor from the children's bedrooms. He came into the room and tried to get into bed with me and assault me, she says. I resisted, and he didn't like that at all. Threat to control. He was angry. Ignition of heated fury. It says something along the lines of maybe next time you'll want it or welcome it. Terrified and trapped in the country mansion with no means of fleeing, she used her pager to contact Natasha, who told her to drag a chest of drawers across the door. The next morning, she was put on a train back to London as though nothing had happened. Compartmentalization. Private meetings with Fayed were initially above board, but then came the forced kisses and the groping that would happen without warning. It was so quick. She explained, it wasn't like he's going to sidle up really slowly. He would grab you, she says. That, the fear, left me paralysed. Despite working in the same office, Natasha and Catherine were not allowed to chat to each other at work, assertion of control. They were forbidden from taking lunch at the same time, assertion of control, and never once left work together, assertion of control. If they wanted to communicate at work, they had to secretly pass notes to each other, making sure they were not spotted by Fayed's PA. They did, though, pluck up the courage to meet up at weekends, becoming firm friends. Though they never told any of their colleagues, they were socialising together for fear it would be reported back to Fayed. Anyone who talked, of course, might discover they were not the only victim, and Fayed was no doubt anxious to avoid that happening. Assertion of control. It's easy for anyone hearing the victims' stories to wonder what stopped them from simply quitting their jobs. Part of the answer, they say, is that they needed to pay the rent. Neither came from well-off families, and Catherine had lost her father when she was a child, as Fayed knew, because he had probed her about it in her job interview, and probably saw a vulnerability not having a father figure, indeed, which the narcissist would exploit. Natasha says that despite everything, I still wanted that job to be the job I thought I was going for. On top of that, of course, was the fear. He turned, says Catherine, her voice trembling and tears starting to form in her eyes, and he was very scary. The tone in which he threatened you, use of threat, left you in no uncertain terms that he meant it, and he would send his security, and they did know where we lived, and if we ever said anything, not only would we never work in London again, but they would come and find us. Use of threat, application of fear to assert control. One victim has even described how John McNamara, Fayed's head of security, told her that she was a girl all alone in London, and someone could jump out of the bushes at you or you could have a sudden accident. Use of lieutenant to convey threat. None of the women regarded such talk as idle threats, hence the reluctance of Catherine and Natasha to take part in the BBC documentary when they were approached. Both of them were so afraid of Fayed when they left Harrods that they left the country for lengthy periods because they no longer felt safe in London or even in the United Kingdom. In Natasha's case, the end came when she was invited to Fayed's Park Lane apartment for what she was told was a job review, and when she got there, the door was locked behind her and Fayed's bedroom door was open with sex toys on view. She sat on the sofa and Fayed pushed himself onto me. They fell to the floor with him on top of her and she managed to kick herself free before running for the door. He laughed at her humiliation and told her that if she ever breathed a word to anyone, she would never work in London again. Threat, adding that he knew where her family lived. Threat. She never went back to the office. In Catherine's case, she was sacked after she pushed Fayed away hard when he tried to go up my blouse. Both women were gone within 8 to 10 months of starting. Accordingly, this demonstrates once again the nature of this sexual predator, a narcissist who operates with showing impunity towards his victims, selecting them on the basis of somaticism, based upon their attractiveness, using vulnerabilities against them, and utilising rudimentary sexual assaults and thereafter the use of threat in order to maintain control over these individuals. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.